John Krasinski's directorial debut, A Quiet Place, was pretty good. In a world where sound gets you killed, you don't exactly have the privilege of tons of speaking. So the main thing I was looking for was visuals, visual details, and visual storytelling. And I felt like it was really well done. A lot of the subtleties in the story are presented visually and they're easy to miss. But the film makes sure you don't forget it, unfortunately. It's a little bit heavy-handed. First of all, I gotta point out that this film is beautifully shot and directed. The film doesn't rely on A shot, B shot when it comes to conversations, instead going for more swooping angles and perspective shots in a lot of places. I really like that, and I thought it was a well-directed movie. The characters were pretty convincing. There was good chemistry between the family. I mean, you would hope so because John Krasinski and Emily Blunt are married in real life, but the kids do a good job of fitting in with the family. The child actors were decent. They weren't really required to overact or anything like that. They had a good sense of panic on their face, and I thought the little deaf girl was a great actress. The film's atmosphere and tone was genuinely unnerving and thrilling for me. Maybe it's because of the theater that I was in, but throughout the entire film, the whole entire theater was completely silent. Like you could hear like your kind of lips smacking and your heart beating. It was very, very quiet in there, and the atmosphere really added to the experience that whenever you heard a sound, it was genuinely unnerving and kind of horrifying because you felt for the characters. I liked that the film was short and sweet. It didn't have a lot of bullshit in between. It was well paced aside from a few slow moments near the beginning, but other than that, I felt like it knew what it was, and it was thrilling the entire time. It's been a while since I've been on the edge of my seat for the entirety of a movie. It doesn't over-explain the creatures or the origin of how the Earth fell, which is strange because a lot of the film over-explains a lot of subtleties and a lot of other things going on, so I'm glad that they left out this part. You get clues and hints throughout the film, but you gotta look out for them, and it doesn't really go into a lot of detail, which I personally really liked. I thought this film had a good soundtrack that added to the mood and atmosphere. While I preferred there to be no soundtrack at all, I would love to see a version without a soundtrack. I felt like it wasn't distracting aside from maybe a few scenes, but overall I felt like it wasn't distracting, and it kind of added to the mood and atmosphere that they were going for. Now, unfortunately, the creature design was very bland for me. You already know I'm not a big fan of American-style monsters because they're all the same fucking thing. So, if you've ever watched Stranger Things and you've seen the Demogorgon, you've seen every single monster design in America. The film is a bit predictable. It's entertaining for sure, but it is predictable. You see things coming from miles away. As soon as a story beat happens, you know what's going to happen at the very end of it. As soon as an object comes into play that wasn't in play earlier, you know exactly what that object is going to do. On top of that, there's also some pretty cheap jump scares, and what I mean by that is just loud noises that shouldn't be loud for no reason, especially in a film where you gotta be quiet. It makes you wonder like, well, did the monsters hear that, or was that just for the audience? It kind of takes you out of the film a little bit. The ending could either be loved or hated by people. I personally liked it. It kind of presents you with an ending similar to The Grey, if you've ever seen that, where it's left to the audience to interpret, but it ends right before what would be a cool action scene, so maybe that's why people won't like it. But I personally found it okay. In order to fully discuss what I liked and disliked about this film, I do have to spoil it. So if you haven't seen A Quiet Place, I definitely recommend you check it out, and you should skip to this part of the video to see my final rating. But for now, I'm going to spoilers, so this is your warning. 3, 2, 1, go. The beginning of the film was probably one of my favorite parts of it, because it uses a lot of the visuals to tell you the story. For example, you can find out that the little girl is deaf right away if you're observant enough. The opening scene of the film has a lot of establishing shots and a lot of shots inside of a marketplace where they're kind of doing stuff. And whenever it cuts to the little girl, the sound is muted. Now, there's not a lot of sound going on in this scene, but you can tell that they muffle it, and that's to imply and for you to figure out that this girl's actually deaf. And I felt like that was pretty clever. And then they just went on and told people that she was deaf. And I'm like, well, you could have just left it at that, and most people would assume that she was deaf just because of how the audio was going. And that's the big problem I had with this movie, is that a lot of it was over-explained, when not necessary either. There's another scene in which Emily Blunt's character is doing laundry, and she's pulling at something because it's stuck on something, and it pulls a nail out from one of the boards. Now, that's totally fine, you know, obviously it's a setup for what's going to come later. But the fact that the shot lingers on the nail for like 12 seconds of what it felt like was a little bit too much for me. It was a little too heavy-handed. As soon as she pulls the thing out, all you need to show is like a second or two of the nail. But this film like menacingly zooms in on it, like, don't forget it. You're gonna forget it. It's gonna come into play later. And I just felt like it was pretty damn heavy-handed. Now it does come into play later in a pretty intense scene in which Emily Blunt's character needs to give birth in a world where, you know, any sort of noise gets you killed. And this is where I felt the film violated its own rules a little bit. Now, obviously, giving birth is extremely painful and requires a lot of screaming and yelling and just exertions of built-up energy that you have in you. But in this film, she tries her best to remain quiet, but she breathes really loudly within the vicinity of the monster. So I just felt like, shouldn't she be dead by now? Like, can't they hear that? I mean, I guess it's like they never go into specifics as to how sensitive their hearing really is. Because at the beginning of the film, obviously it's a really loud toy, that's what gets the little boy killed, and then the man screams in an earlier scene to get himself killed. So you're left to assume that it's really loud noises, right? But later on in the film, the creatures react to a high frequency, a high-pitched frequency. Now, that's pretty quiet. Most people can't even hear that. And it's established that the other characters don't hear it until the little girl puts it on the microphone, and that kind of explodes the sound. So was Emily Blunt just not sighing at a high enough frequency? Is that what that was? Is it frequency based? Is it volume based? We don't really know. But, you know, obviously she gets saved with fireworks and everything, and she's able to give birth safely. And that's another thing I didn't really like with the film, was the climax and finding out the alien's weakness. Now, as I said earlier, they're weak to really high frequencies, and it makes their head go all swollen and giant and being able to get shot with a shotgun. But really? That's their weakness? A whole team, the entire planet full of scientists couldn't figure that out? That if you just kind of destroy what they're best at, which is their hearing, that you'll be able to be fine and be able to destroy them. I just found it really just not well thought out in a movie that I thought was pretty well thought out. It tackled a lot of the questions that I had, like how do they survive? What do they do day to day? You know, how is it that they just don't make any fucking noise? In a film that I thought was well thought out with its ideas, this part seemed the weakest to me, in that they clearly didn't think out the alien's weakness, because, you know, you're just left to assume, like, how the fuck did no one figure that out? They had enough time to publish several newspapers about the aliens, which takes a while. You know, newspapers come out like once a week or something. So they at least had a few weeks to figure it out. And you're telling me that no one, an entire planet full of 8 billion people, could not figure out that maybe putting it at a higher frequency would kill them? I don't know. It seems a little bit fishy. It definitely played with my suspension of disbelief just a little bit. A lot of people are pointing out that they're disappointed that they didn't get to see the fall of Earth and the initial invasion, if there was one, because a lot of people are assuming that the aliens sent like ground troops to take over the Earth and, you know, to kill us all, and then these things kind of just wipe out the rest of us. But I don't like that theory, because we don't ever see the ground troops. It's never implied that there was a first initial wave of attack in the film. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So I'm just going to be left to assume that these creatures were the ones that initially invaded, and these creatures are the ones that stuck around to kind of wipe us out. The film takes place probably about half a year after the invasion, after the initial attack. And I like that because we just always see it now. I was expecting this film to open up with like newsreels and like a montage of the news talking about what's going on, and it's so fucking cliche and so boring at this point that I'm glad that this film stayed away from it and just set us in a world where this is what it is now, and fucking deal with it. We're not going to explain a whole lot. Overall, this film was thrilling, unnerving, had great characters, and a hell of an atmosphere and mood. The unfortunate creature design and heavy-handedness wasn't enough to deter how much I liked this movie. John Krasinski is starting his career as a director in a strong way, and I'll be looking forward to anything he puts out in the future. And I'm giving The Quiet Place a 7 out of 10.